Good evening. Welcome to Bible class. Tonight we have a slightly different setup. You'll notice that we're not in the same room. We had a few extra circumstances, but it's Matthew Werner, staff minister at Grace, as well as
Pastor Jensen.
And we're excited to be able to continue to give you Bible class in this kind of unique way for us. As we're doing this, one of the things that you'll note is that live chat is not enabled. And the reason that we're doing that is we've actually pre-recorded this Bible study. Again, due to extra circumstances, that's what we're trying out tonight to see how that works. So that'll mean that there is no chat. So you can't check in, you can't ask questions or things like that. That's not necessarily something that's going to stay the same. We're simply doing that for this particular class, maybe future classes too, when we need to be able to do that. But tonight we're doing that not because we want chat to be done with, but simply because we're in different places.
Maybe to jump onto that too, that if you do have questions or comments that come up since you don't have the opportunity live chat, please feel free to email Staff Minister Werner or myself with those.
Yes, that's always fun. I enjoy getting those emails. It's fun, or phone calls. It's fun to have those conversations. That's great to get those. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Gideon. If you take a look at the PDF, which is available for you in the same place that it always is by looking in that section, you can download it, you can interact with that. If you take a look at the timeline, Gideon falls into the timeline of the Judges. And the Judges really is a period of time. You see on the top there how the Israelites have entered into the Promised Land. They've conquered the Promised Land. And then we're going to see that throughout the book of Judges, they have different leaders that God appoints to come and give them deliverance from some of the surrounding nations. With those nations, the reason that they're still there is because the Israelites didn't carry out God's command to get rid of those nations, so they're still there, and the Israelites are feeling the effects of not following what God had commanded them to do. When you're taking a look up there, you get a chance, and also at the bottom of the sheet, you see those things. Really kind of neat to get a chance to see how all of it falls in place with the fall of Jericho, Joshua marching around, conquest of Canaan. And then you get some of the names of some of those judges like Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Jephthah, Samuel, Samson. Some of those names you may be familiar with, some of them you aren't. What's kind of fun about Judges is that some of those judges, it's pretty easy to get caught up with what they do and with their accounts. So if you do have time during the week, take a time to kind of peruse the book of Judges and get a sense for who some of those other judges are, because God certainly uses them in unique ways to deliver his people. Anything that you want to add, Pastor Jensen, just to the time of the Judges, maybe some of those people?
You know, one of the things when it comes to Judges, sometimes we keep track of history, whether it's just history secularly or biblical history regarding the leaders, the people. Up to this point, we had Moses as primary leader, shifted to Joshua. After the time of Judges, it's going to be a little clearer because we're going to go into King Saul and King David and Solomon. The Judges gets a little messy with that because you don't necessarily have one clear, distinct leader who's ruling over the whole people. You do have these leaders, these judges that God has raised up, but sometimes they're regional and sometimes they overlap too.
So that certainly is an interesting thing to think about with the overlap that could be taking place with some of them. I know when we were talking about this previously, thinking about Samson and maybe overlap with Samuel was one that was kind of a little mind-boggling because that's not how I always think of those two people. So as we jump into Gideon today, we'll get to see an example of one of those judges. And the overall theme that we really want to touch on is God strengthening Gideon and how God strengthens us. And it's really unique how God goes about talking to Gideon, what God does for Gideon. And we see this awesome way that God provides for the individual needs of people, for Gideon and also for the rest of the people in this account. And we also want to think about that in our own lives, how God strengthens us and prepares us for the unique situations and callings that we find ourselves in. So with that, we'll be taking a look at Judges chapter 6, and we're going to take a look beginning with verse 33. And we'll read through to verse 40. So here we go from Judges 6, verse 33. Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern people joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they too went up to meet them. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowlful of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. This time make the fleece dry and the ground covered with dew." That night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew.
One of the things we probably should do, we mentioned the context, the background of Judges as a whole, but what about Gideon himself and where we're at? Leading up to this, God has called Gideon, has appeared to Gideon, and directly said, "You're going to lead my people to deliver them from the Midianites." Well, now what was Midian doing? Midianites were coming in, and for years they'd come and they would destroy the crops, take them for their own, and take the animals the Israelites had, essentially plundering them. The Israelites were hiding in caves to stay safe. Even when God came to call Midian, there he is hiding at the bottom of a wine press.
I think that becomes a really important and significant thing in understanding the time of the Judges, is just these hills and valleys that the Israelites go through. There certainly are periods that they are going through good times, but then they also face these difficult times. It's one of those things to picture them having to hide in caves because things are so bad, just gives you a sense for the current times that the Israelites are in, and that it's not easy for them. Another part of that also becomes, I guess, just identifying where Gideon comes from. And the Bible makes it pretty clear to us that Gideon comes from a tribe that is not very reputable, that the tribe that he comes from doesn't have a lot of good reputation with following God. And that also factors into the uniqueness of calling Gideon, and maybe in understanding some of the things that we'll see from Gideon later on, just in terms of some of the questions and doubts that he presents. I think a lot of that comes from where Gideon is coming from this area of weakness, from being oppressed. He doesn't have that confidence that you may expect of a leader.
Maybe one last background thing too to mention, as we're going to see these unlikely scenarios. Okay, we wouldn't have expected Gideon, to also recognize that maybe from the outside, without seeing the whole context, you look and this didn't seem like a likely scenario. The Midianites coming and oppressing, and what's going on here now, they need deliverance. But this was actually something set up by the hand of God right here, that already they were coming because God had sent them. In Judges chapter 6, verse 1, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. The Midianites were given because they were an instrument of God's wrath against Israel because of Israel's idolatry. And even before God raised up Gideon, when we see the unlikely, the Israelites cried out, and God said, "I sent you a prophet before Gideon, and he rebuked you because you worship idols." And so you see that unlikely, and even that God now would deliver his people, even though they haven't listened to him.
If you're following along on the sheet there, the significance of all these other nations, we start to get that. Some of them mentioned there. And I think one of the things to really highlight in reference to that question is not that they just come up, but that there's history that is involved with the Israelites here. They're not just, okay, one-time oppressors, but there's a deeper history there. And Pastor Jensen, if you could maybe just comment maybe on a little of that.
Yeah, you see that, okay, Midianites, where do these people come from? The Midianites, if we look back, I mean, that goes back to Abraham. That goes back to one of Abraham's descendants, not long, but one of Abraham's children there that he had with what we'd say his third wife. If you're counting them off, you count Sarah, his first wife, Hagar, maidservant, but acted as a wife to Abraham. And then you get his third wife after Sarah dies, Keturah. And you see it really was a blessing. Okay, many children there. Midian is one of them. The Amalekites who are joined in, that comes through descendants of Esau. And so, I mean, long distance relatives for the Israelites.
And that certainly helps us to understand, I think, a little bit of some of that interconnectedness that goes on, maybe some of that familiarity that they have with each other. So that next question that we have there, why does Gideon need this strengthening? And that kind of gets into these signs a little bit too, that we get these signs that are given to Gideon in regards to this fleece. They're amazing, but they're so insignificant at the same time.
You see Gideon, he goes and he's asking for these signs. Now, before this, Gideon had already asked God for signs, and God has shown signs through fire, and that wasn't enough. Now, Gideon, knowing he's going up against a large enemy, Midian is huge, 135,000, we're going to see. And before he's about to gather the people, he's already made the call first to the Abiezrites, his own clan, to his own tribe, Manasseh, and then to the surrounding tribes, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. He's gathered people, but you can understand the fear that Gideon would have. It's a small group of people in comparison to the army of Midian. And so he goes and asks God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, make these signs. And the strange thing I think about these signs is they seem to be so unrelated to the task at hand for Gideon.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's not this show of great power that you might expect him to ask for, but instead kind of tiny things.
And maybe just, thinking that through, okay, you're asking for the first time that placing a wool fleece there, that only the wool fleece is wet the next morning, the ground is dry, no dew on it, and then vice versa the next time. It may seem like some small thing, but can you do it?
No, I can't. And I think that's what makes it so special as well, is just that idea that it's something that you can easily understand, even in our times. There's not that barrier that might exist with other biblical miracles or signs or things where we're not familiar with dew or might not be familiar with words that are used. But no, we get the dew. We understand that on some days there's a lot of dew, some days there's not. And if I put a shirt or a towel out there and it's filled with water, the ground around it, so is that towel. So we get this.
And that's the thing, we can't control the dew there. It's going to come when it comes according to the weather, and it's going to affect all of it. It's not as if we can set boundaries unless we are literally enclosing things to protect them. That's not the case here. And I think that's, you look at this sign, you realize Gideon is asking God to do something that only God has power over, nature and the weather, and to recognize, okay, well, it seems like this is so disconnected from what God's going to do. Well, if God has the power over these things, how much more power does God have over the rest of creation, over Gideon's own army and their battle, and what he's going to have their strength of the humans working? Okay, if God can control the things of nature, we have nothing to fear.
Yeah. It's sort of funny to list this right along with some of those other things. Jesus in the storm saying, be still, or the waters of the Red Sea parting, but it really is, again, that power over nature.
You list those off, and it's like you think of those iconic images of Moses with his staff there at the Red Sea, or Jesus there on the boat shouting the storm. And maybe we should lift him, fleece be wet.
Well, make sure that you have that as a painting or a picture in your new office.
Yeah, maybe the other thing too to think about, and put yourself in Gideon's shoes. He asks this of God. God doesn't tell him he's going to do it. He just does it.
Yeah, that's powerful. And again, it just speaks to God not always following those same patterns, sort of similar to what we saw with the plagues in Moses, that there was different things that happened. He didn't always do it in the same way. And we see that again here, in that he doesn't say, I'm going to do it. Gideon just wakes up and it is what he asked for.
And the reassurance that comes with Gideon, that it simply happens. He doesn't need even the word of the Lord there, but because God has answered his request, that's reassuring there. And the thing too in our lives, when we make prayers to God asking for him to do something for us, now does he always do it? No. But when he does, that is a source of strength for us, that he has blessed us in this way.
I think I find that to be something that is really powerful about being surrounded by Christian friends, or at least having close Christian friends, because I find that there are times when, we might share prayers or things like that, and just to be reminded that, oh yeah, God is answering that prayer. God is doing that, because at times I find it pretty easy to overlook those answers to prayers, those amazing things. And just to go about, oh, I asked for it, God did it, no big deal. But when you have those around you that can remind you and point you to, yeah, God is the source of this, it's a really helpful thing.
No, I think that's exactly an encouragement there too, because you think of those things we ask them and they happen, and they probably aren't as extraordinary and asking God to defy the laws of nature he set up as Gideon here. But nonetheless, still evidence, okay, here God is blessing and he is, listening to our prayers.
I think maybe also somewhat of a reminder to be bold in prayer. I know that there are plenty, like with this prayer, I think I personally would probably feel a little bit ridiculous asking for something like this, questioning my own faith and thinking like, do I really need this sign, God? Because I know what you've said in your word. But at the same time, to be reminded, we can be bold in our prayer and know that God certainly has the power to answer those prayers.
It's like Jesus says, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can move mountains. Okay, that's an encouragement, not saying God's promises he's going to move mountains, but to be bold there in that prayer.
Such a powerful reminder to find here. All right, let's continue then with our next section from Judges chapter 7, verse 1. And we'll see where this takes Gideon next. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands. In order that Israel may not boast against me, that her own strength has saved her, announce now to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, "There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will sift them for you there. If I say, this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink." 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the other men go, each to his own place." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites to their tents, but kept the 300, who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others.
You have, starting out that first verse, Jerubbaal, maybe just a little context there too. It's right there. That is Gideon. It's just another name for Gideon. He had earned that name. You maybe not think of a name that has the word Baal in it as being something good, Baal being false god that the Canaanites worshipped. But Jerubbaal means against Baal. And previous to this, God had asked Gideon to put his house in order. His own father had an altar to Baal, and Gideon, following what God said, tore down that altar, and so hence got this name against Baal.
Need to connect that meaning with that name there. We get those words in verse 2 that I think are also of interest. What God says to Gideon, he makes it clear to him that he has too many men. And the reason that he gives for there being too many is in order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her. So when we see that, we see that I think that reveals something to us about the Israelites and about God. What do you think that it kind of tells us about the Israelites?
Well, it seems to me that they're susceptible to boasting about themselves. And that, okay, boast, so that Israel not boast against me in her own strength. It's this, they have this tendency to look at what I did, look what we accomplished, when it's good at least.
Yeah.
And you've seen this in the wilderness too, and things like that. When things are good, this is, look what we've done. When things are bad, God, what have you caused for us? But okay, and so here they are. Midian is still oppressing them, and God is looking ahead and saying, right now they're not delivered, but once they're delivered, how easily they may be saying, look what our own hands have done, the victory we've given ourselves. And maybe don't put it in numbers too. They have 32,000 people. We get that from the number there, 22,000 men left in verse 3 and 10,000 will remain. If you page ahead to chapter 8, when you see Gideon in the army pursuing the Midianites, you get in chapter 8, verse 10, saying about 15,000 were remaining because 120,000 had fallen. So you get 135,000 Midianites. You run that ratio, and it's about a 1-to-4. That's still not good odds. Not good odds. But you could see the tendency and the temptation there of, oh, well, we did it. Look at us. Against the odds, we did it. Maybe one other thought, too, that we don't necessarily think about is even just how God phrases this. He says, you have too many men for me to deliver. Now, what is too great for God to do? Okay, it's not as if there had too many men that God couldn't deliver Midian, but too many men for God to accomplish his purpose of what he wants and to show that deliverance does come in. That strength comes from God, not from your own hands.
It's, I think, worthwhile to take this account and to have that idea of God taking away those fighters, bringing glory to himself, and to think about how, really, first that question of, does God use this strategy in our own lives?
I think that's an interesting thought to think about, because I think often, I would say for myself, when all of a sudden something difficult happens in my life, or something is removed from my life that I'm used to having, it's all of a sudden I am going through hardship now. It's, I have to bear this, or even the very easy answer, why God would you let this happen? Almost not saying, God, you're doing this or moving this as a blessing for this, but almost you're now testing me to endure.
And I guess when we think of that idea of God testing us to endure, is that something that we can look at as being a good thing, as being something that is important for us?
And I think it definitely is. And that's to recognize, okay, when God takes things away from us, it's sometimes also to deliver us from other dangers. And to think about that, okay, he takes away and says, these are too many men, Gideon. First off, thank God, look how God's people responded. Praise God for that. 32,000 showed up, ready to fight against 135,000. But God says, no, you're actually in a greater danger if I leave you with 32,000. Greater danger than the Midianites.
God's wisdom in that is just incredible.
Yeah, a danger of trusting in yourself I mean, it took the Midianites and their oppression over years for you finally to turn back to me, and I'm not ready to let that slip away so quickly. So I'm going to take this away and think now in our lives, how does God do that? How does he remove danger, deliver us from danger by just taking away things that we probably see as blessings? There's some pretty easy ones, I think. I mean, you can look at money and say, all right, well, whether it was maybe, loss of income or loss of investments or things like that, or just a loss of opportunity. And you say, oh, God, this is no longer my life. This has been taken away from me. But perhaps there are greater dangers to our souls that he has now safeguarded against.
Certainly. I think health can easily fall into that same line of, I know for me, taking good health for granted and just going along, oh, I'm not thanking God for healthy life, for working, body, all this kind of stuff. And then the moment that something falters, how quickly my prayers turn towards that. And it very much becomes just this quick call back to me. And it's one of those things, I think, that's a little embarrassing at times to see how quickly those things can shift. But it's certainly, I've experienced that in my own life with various things, health being one of them. And I think that has served that purpose of bringing me closer to God, which is so important.
Maybe I was thinking through as we've been dealing with this pandemic, I think we can very easily find, okay, whether it's those things of different money or health and things that have been affecting, just how God has maybe taken away things in our life. Taken away, maybe it's the interaction with people, that becomes what all our life is about, and that socialization. Maybe it's the different ways that we in our minds have crafted, okay, this is how my life's going to look and plan, and this is how we're going to accomplish things. And God takes it away to remind us, no, don't boast in yourself, your own strength, or what you plan to do or how you achieve things. He is the one who gives strength.
There have been so many different times during the last couple of months of having those kind of conversations for me with many different people. And it's fun how often those conversations have turned from negative into, but this is something good that's happening as a result of, quarantine, or as a result of not getting to do certain things. And it's been really amazing to see so many people identify those blessings and to say, yeah, there are these difficulties, but then to also just turn those and to so easily see some of the blessings. And it's just fun to see that. And it's been fun to encounter that in my own life too. If you just think of something simple like staying at home, and you just think about how that doesn't seem like that big of a deal. I know for me, it's led me to think back to times that aren't that long ago and just to rejoice in people getting together. I was filling out a report for this fundraising event that we do at Grace, our Valentine's meal. And that event took place on February 15th of this year. And on February 15th, I looked back at my records and it said we had 75 plus people gathered in the Quali Room in room 18. And you think about that, and if you saw video, if you saw things of that today, I think I might even feel a little bit uncomfortable with that, just because it's if the Quali Room, if room 18 in our church, those are such small areas. There were 75 plus people in those areas.
Yeah, we're not going to do that anytime soon.
Yeah, very true, very true. Not suggesting that we're gonna have that happen, but just a reminder of that blessing, to look back at it and say, wow, this was something that was really cool to see people gathered. I've felt that same way with various church services as well, where, in a much larger space in our gymnasium, 6 feet apart for everyone, but having 80 people in church, it just filled my heart. I'm a social person. I enjoy being around people, so it makes sense that I would feel that way, but it's just overwhelming to just rejoice in that And that's something that 3 months ago, 110 people show up to church, and I kind of shrug my shoulders.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's just, it's just the idea to think that God taking something away from us isn't meaning he's punishing us. It doesn't even necessarily mean he's testing us either. It can simply be he's doing that because he's protecting us.
And those are powerful ways to think about God in our lives. It's so easy to get into that mindset, like you said, of just framing it in either he's doing good or he's doing bad. But there's so much more. And what's amazing is that we know that it falls under the good, because he promises us that he's going to work for the good of those who love him. And so all those things that you mentioned fit under that he's working for our good.
Yeah.
In so many different ways.
It's interesting how God narrows them down.
Yeah, let's talk about that. It's something that is hard to visualize. So we get this, how they drink water. So I think in my own mind, what this starts to look like is we've got people that put their hands and like form a cup and then drink out of that cup of water. And then you have those that are bending all the way down and just lapping the water directly out of the source of water. So you see people down on their hands and knees versus those that maybe aren't doing that.
Yeah, and before we even get there, God's already whittled it down, sending 22,000 men home, saying, if you're afraid, if you're trembling with fear, just go. You don't need to stay. And so protecting in some ways, you say, against their own hearts of, you don't be acting now in fear. I'm here to remove your fear, not to increase it. And then
really, you identify the 1-to-4 ratio, and the 20,000 that now leave give us more in that 1 to 10 range, right?
Yeah, 1 to 10, 1 to 13-ish. Yeah. Still not, all of a sudden, much more challenging to fight against. You think of hand-to-hand combat here. I won't want to go against 4 people to begin with myself, 1 on 4, but you definitely don't want to go 1 on 13. Yeah. But then, okay, as you mentioned, with how they're drinking water, we're going to get much less. So we're going to get to about a 1 to 450 ratio.
And that's where your eyes really start to open and say, okay, we've got these 300 men that are going to be fighting against 150,000 plus.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You mentioned as far as they're drinking water, and you got some who kneel down. Those are the ones who are going to go home. That they kneel down, put their face right in the water. The ones who kind of cup it up and drink, those 300 get to stay. Is there significance behind this? Is it just coincidence? I mean, I guess you gotta go further and say this can't just be coincidence. God told Gideon he's going to tell you which one to stay and which one to go. And so the fact that it's 300, that's the number God wanted, that these are the ones who cup it up. There's some interesting thoughts out there. I know I've heard a few as far as why one, not the other.
One that I just enjoy, and I'm not saying that this is the reason, but one that I've heard speculated on is the idea that the ones that can get down and sip the water are the ones that are more able-bodied. So the picture that I guess has kind of been etched in my mind through a sermon and other things is this idea that these 300 men that are there are the ones that are much older, that maybe have some sort of disability that prevents them from being able to stay down on the ground for long periods of time. Not necessarily, the Bible doesn't tell us that, but it's one that has etched that picture in my mind of this particular account from Scripture. It's sort of fun about it that way.
And I think that one, the whole idea that God is showing here is that it's going to be His strength. And so maybe that there is something to that. I just read a different one earlier today, that those who kneel down, because they would kneel, they're more disposed to kneeling down and worship the idols. I'm not so sure there is as much to maybe say there's strength behind that argument. It's, I guess, an interesting thought that someone came up with as to why that and not the other. But I think we probably want to shift ourselves more to, okay, we see that this is going to be on God's strength. He is separated, so we're leaving only 300. The means He did it, it was His way of going about it. to accomplish a small number.
And he gets there to an incredibly small number. Yeah. If you're following along on that that worksheet, we've made our way really through those questions. We talked about the idea of God using that strategy in our own lives. We really walked through those things pretty in depth. So next, we'll take a look at the actual deliverance that takes place. So we'll pick up in the second part of verse 8, so 8b, and then we'll continue through to verse 23. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night, the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped God. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up. The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. "Watch me," he told them. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon." Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn to each other with their swords. The army fled to Bethshittah towards Zerarah, as far as the border of Abel-Meholah near Tabbath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites.
What strikes me as we begin these verses and look at them is here we have another sign. Yet this time, Gideon didn't ask for it. God just gave it to him. And it shows, okay, God knows the hearts of his people. After already letting all those who tremble go home of the Israelite army, he also knows that the general is still fearful. And so he says, if you are afraid to attack, go down and listen to what you hear.
That's so powerful to see God just knowing what is going on in Gideon's heart at this moment, that he understands that while Gideon still got to stay, even though the ones that were afraid left, God still sees that fear that Gideon has, and he gives him and Purah really this extra encouragement that and the encouragement that they get is also pretty wild.
Yeah, they go down and they're going to listen. First off, right at the outpost of the camp, they're going to listen to a dream that a Midianite had and what that means. And what's striking with that dream, okay, once again, we've seen with the fleece that, okay, it seems kind of in some ways unlikely. How is this going to give you the strength? Well, how is listening to someone's dream going to give you strength to go into battle? Well, it's what he hears in that dream, what's happens and what the interpretation from those Midianites talking that this barley bread comes tumbling in, destroys the Midianite camp, and the Midianite friend responds that this is nothing other than the sword of Gideon. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands.
That does, I think, show something that is noteworthy about what the Israelites have been doing, that it's known to them. This isn't like a secret group or a stealth attack that's going on. Gideon's been sending people out. He's been issuing these declarations to people to come to him, and it seems like they're aware of him and they're aware of what's been going on.
This is no surprise attack that the Israelites are going to take on Midianites. And Midianites, they're well aware, and at this point, probably up to this dream, no one probably cared. When you had 135,000, you can only imagine. It must have been like the running joke in the camp. Yep, they got 32,000 out there. Okay, they're going to come and fight against. Oh, 22 of them, 1,000 went home because they were too afraid. Oh,
yeah. And
now that 300? Come on.
Yeah, exactly. And it really does just emphasize like you said, that confidence that they must have had, because there's just no way. I think that's something that we lose a little bit in not understanding ancient warfare extremely well, just in the sense that we don't, deal with numbers of people in that same way. But you look back at that, and I think that when you talk about major upset victories in history, we see that these are things that are remembered when there are these massive amounts of people, and then they end up winning in one way or another. And you look back at those historical accounts, and I guess ones that come to my mind are Thermopylae, the 300 people. I think about with the Mongolians and their use of elephants and these things that in those cases they're amazing, and we remember them and we highlight them in our history books. But at the same time, there's lots of things that are working in those people's favor versus the Israelites who seemingly have nothing going for them.
No, not really. I mean, you talk about, obviously their numbers have significantly decreased, and they haven't decreased because of illness or anything. That literally God just sent them home. They're up on, the Midianites are in the valley, and the Israelites are sitting then on the high ground. Now, normally you'd say that that's an advantageous position, except the attacking roles are reverse. It's advantageous if you're defending from the high ground. If you're there and you have the enemy trying to approach you, come up, yeah, you've got the prime spot. But the Israelites are going to leave the high ground, and they are going to put themselves on equal plane with the Midianites coming down into the valley to attack. Plus, the Israelites are the ones on the attack. It's easier to defend when you have smaller numbers, but the Israelites are on the offense. They're coming at, and they've got the smaller group.
It doesn't seem like a very wise, situation to put yourself into.
No, I mean, and really the only reason you do it, as the Israel are doing and Gideon's doing, is because God is on their side, and you see why Gideon may have been fearful, thinking all these military considerations in hand. And you mentioned this too, as already that you see, okay, the Midianites are aware. And I think that adds to the encouragement here for Gideon from this dream. The Midianites know about the Israelites. They all of a sudden they hear this dream, and this is what they understand it to be, but they name Gideon. What an encouragement there that God gave, that Gideon heard his name before asking for the fleece. If you are really going to use me to deliver as you promised. Well, here he has the enemy saying his name, and that this is what God's going to do.
And that really does go back to just really in a brief amount of text, but just this huge shift for Gideon from being the man that was hiding in the wine press, the man that comes from this tribe that doesn't have a great reputation, and now to hear his name being spoken in the camp of the enemy just shows how quickly things are changing for Gideon.
And spoken of in fear too. It's right. It's not we're laughing at Gideon like they probably had been before. This is none other than Gideon. He's going to come and destroy our camp.
What a boost for him. And again, just to see God working to strengthen Gideon in a way that you might not have expected it. And yet this is what God knew had to be done for Gideon in order to strengthen him.
He knows what Gideon needs, and he gives it to Gideon. Even when Gideon doesn't ask, he gives just what he needs. And I can think of so many times in my life that may be going through a more difficult patch, and all of a sudden God brings something in, whether it is through our fellow believers, whether it's simply some encouragement, an email, or whatever it may be. Those little, didn't even ask God for it. Should have asked God for it in prayer, but didn't. And yet God just gives with the strength that he knows we need.
And that just, it fills my heart just with gladness to know that that's who our God is, and to know that providence, that care that he has for each and every one of us is something that's how he's dealing with us. He's not dealing with us on, like not caring about us or setting us aside for the good of the greater good or something like that, but rather, no, he knows. And you just think of that encouragement too. He knows you by name. He knows all of us by name, and he knows all these things about us, and he cares for us.
And how God can perfectly deal with the group, but also the individual at the same time. He's using Gideon to deliver his people, the group, from the Midianites, but at the same time, he is building up and strengthening his individual servant Gideon in the process.
Yeah. What about this dream that's heard? There's kind of some weird imagery going on in there. We get this barley loaf. What's going on with the dream? What does this? I mean, we get the meaning, why they interpret it, but why this bread that comes tumbling in? Why is it barley?
I think as we look at the rest of Scripture, what Midian was doing to the Israelites, they were taking their crops. And so here you see a picture of a crop. Now, barley is not a very, I would say, valuable crop. It's obviously food, but it would be one of those lesser crops. And so there maybe you see, okay, the weakness that they would have seen Gideon and the Israelites as, but yet it comes in and destroys their camp.
I think it's also worth pointing out just the way that they go about conquering, what they go into battle with. We read about the trumpets and the jars, and that's what they go to do. We certainly see that Gideon has a plan about what to do. So that's good to point out as well, that it's not as if it's just screaming back to the guys and, hey, let's go conquer them. But there's more to it than just that.
And it's something that we discussed leading into this class, preparing you would compare to, this isn't Jericho. This is not God gave this plan, march around the city once for 7 days, and on the seventh day march around 7 times. No, Gideon is just putting together this plan. We have no record that God specifically gave him. And you see there, maybe perhaps as God has built up his leader, Gideon responds, okay, victory is coming from the Lord. This is how we're going to split up and do this. But at the same time, you see it's not necessarily because of Gideon's expertise military tactics that they win.
Right. And you look at that, and while you can, you can marvel at the plan a little bit, you would still say, okay, you did this smart thing and it confused them for a few minutes, and now the 300 men got massacred. And that's where we see it. Obviously, this is not because of Gideon's planning, like you said, but we get God's hand. And Scripture makes it very plain to us that he confuses the people. He fills them with fear. He does these things. It's not these 300 men and their extremely loud trumpets.
Yeah, verse 22, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. Certainly, they shouted, they blew it in the middle of the night. People wake up and, okay, people, but very clearly, God tells us he is the one who caused it. The Lord who's given this promise to Gideon, I'm going to deliver you, and now he's keeping it. We had talked about with this as far as what would a movie of this look like, and it's quite the sight and picture that's been created here. I mean, I think Gideon is actually one of the more memorable judges for this battle. You have the jars and the trumpets and the torches, but then to recognize, okay, to try to put this into a movie is very challenging, actually, to actually represent what's happening here, because you can create this image, but how do you show the confusion because that the Lord is causing? How do you show these things that really God's hand behind all of it? It's hard to put it visibly because it wasn't visible.
Right. I know I very much started thinking like, yeah, this would be an awesome movie. And then by the time we started to, kind of get down to some of those details, it became how in the world are you going to show that this is God that's doing this without making it not seem like it was God, but rather like some weird mist, or I don't know, something like that. And I think that just speaks to just the depth of this miracle, just how amazing it truly is, that it's hard to capture in picture. And maybe that's why, I'm sure that is why we have it written for us rather than depicted in picture. But
And I mean, as the saying goes, the book's better than the movie. And that's true here too.
turns out there was a movie, right, in like the 1950s or something that tried to do this. I didn't watch all of it. I watched a little bit of it. Maybe some of you have seen it. I was not that impressed, but
the details that God reveals in His Word, we can't recreate that.
Yeah, that just tells it. And that's been something that has been really encouraging throughout this, as we read through these historical accounts. I think you could start this Bible class with that idea of, okay, so we're going to go back and we're going to study these Old Testament accounts and kind of wondering, what does this have to do with me? I want to talk about other things. But time and time again, when we sit and we study these things, you just come away with, okay, it clearly is just so applicable. It has so much to say about what we are going through, what it's speaking to us. And that shows the power of God's word as well as the power of the Holy Spirit in an amazing way.
As I'm thinking through in some of these things, you can as we're talking about the strength that God gives us, you can certainly see visible ways that God has given strength here, whether it was the fleece, whether it was the dream, whether it was simply now the army is turning itself against its Midian and killing themselves. And honestly, Israelites, from here, it doesn't even seem like they had to pick up a sword for a while.
Right.
Also, you see, looking through this account, the strength that God gives us through things we don't see, things that our physical senses don't experience. Things like God didn't tell Gideon, I'll answer your request. There was no spoken confirming it there. Things of those being taken away, of all of a sudden those what? 31,700 people are no longer there with them. And then you see the things unseen here of God causing that confusion.
Yeah, and things that just relied on their trust, ultimately. Even as they're doing this, they still cannot have lost track of the fact that there are only 300 of them and over 150,000 of the enemy. And yet just that trust that they have that, okay, God has promised us that they are going to be delivered into our hands.
Yeah, and He does just that. And after all that's said and done, where does the credit go to? God alone, because He made it very clear to them that it was just Him alone doing it.
Yeah. Which is, I think, a wonderful reminder for us too, as to how we live our lives, which is just in that utmost trust in God. And we see a great example of it too, that doesn't discount planning, that doesn't discount wise judgment, but ultimately we recognize that He's in control and he's going to take care of those things.
And He does it obviously right here, proclaiming deliverance to His people. A deliverance of physical, a deliverance spiritual for their own hearts, so that they did trust in Him.
Awesome. All right, that really brings us to the end. There are some questions that are on that sheet. Some of these can always be good ones to be able to go back to, whether you go back to the account over the course of the week and just want to become more familiar with it. One of the questions was, name at least 3 things about this attack that are utterly impossible with God. There are so many of them. And I think that as you read and wrestle with that text, you find them as you read through that. And then finally, that last question, how does this account show God's providence for His children? When we talk about God's providence, we're talking about His individual care for each and every one of us. And really what we've continued to see is God's providence for Gideon and giving him this personal strength. And I think what we also want to be able to leave with is just that idea of how God's providence shows up in your own lives, and the way that God has strengthened you How does God regularly strengthen you? And yes, there are obvious answers. You think about going back to the word, worshiping God, all those things. We know that. But then also taking that a step further, to think, okay, this particular hardship that is in your life right now or coming up, how did God provide for you? What word from God have you heard that strengthened you for that situation? What thing has he done that has helped you in that? And to know that he does that.
And I think it's good too, as you think there, look at the different kinds of ways he does provide. Look in the ways, maybe recently, how has he provided for a physical need of yours? How has he done that maybe in the midst of it being kind of challenging, how he's still taking care of you physically? Also, then maybe looking how he's taking care of you spiritually. Maybe it has been by putting a physical burden upon you so that you do turn your trust into him. And as we see over the past few months of the pandemic being difficult and things being taken away, I think we still see God very much providing for his people physically and spiritually.
Amen. The last two things that I want to make you aware of is, as you know, just in case you haven't been trying to get into that chat function and been like, why isn't it working? This one was pre-recorded. As we come into next week may also be pre-recorded. We've got a little bit of a conflict coming up with that too. So you'll either have another pre-recorded message or you'll see just me. And then, not necessarily promising that that'll be the case going forward. We may make use of that chat function again, but we will probably have some kind of pre-recorded message for next time, and we'll do some more thinking about that chat functionality. If you do have feedback about that, please don't hesitate to email Pastor Jensen or myself. We're always looking for feedback, ways that we can improve as we continue to try to share God's word with you in this new way for us, trying to do this, virtually, rather than being together.
I'll say next time then we move out of the period of the judges, and next time Israel asks for a king and so they get one, God blesses them with that. Perhaps we'll see blessings there of him giving things, also perhaps blessings as he's trying to protect them from things too. We look at King Saul next time.
All right, sounds good. We'll see you again next week then.